When we hear the phrase global arms race, our minds almost always jump straight to nuclear submarines, or maybe artificial intelligence, right? But today, we are looking at the CRISPR race. We're going to explore exactly why the US and China are essentially playing God with human DNA. Because think about it. What if the country that wins the gene editing race ends up controlling the future of human life itself? Welcome to The Explaining.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand where we are, we have to go back to 2018. That year, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced something that literally sent shockwaves through the global scientific community. He actually used a gene editing tool to alter the DNA of 2 human babies before they were even born. The global outrage? It was massive and immediate. He Jiankui ultimately went to prison for it. But here's the thing, the story definitely didn't end with his prison sentence. The 2 global superpowers, the United States and China, never actually stopped their race to master this technology. They just went much, much quieter about it. And the speed of this whole escalation? It's absolutely staggering. Since that 2018 scandal, the silent race has only kicked into higher gear. In 2020, researchers Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier actually won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how to essentially weaponize this biological mechanism. And then, bam, by 2023, we started hitting massive commercial milestones, like the approval of a completely revolutionary sickle cell drug called Casv. At this point, the train has completely left the station.
Section 1. What exactly is CRISPR?
So just as a quick refresher, CRISPR is basically the ultimate set of molecular scissors. It was originally just a bacterial defense mechanism against viruses, but scientists figured out how to use it as a hyper-precise find and replace function. It's literally like using Microsoft Word, but for the fundamental code of life. You just tell the system, hey, find this specific gene, cut it out, and paste this new sequence right there. And it does it with a level of precision we've never really seen before.
But the precision isn't even the wildest part. It's the cost. In under a decade, we've gone from spending millions of dollars per experiment to just a few $100. Literally a few $100. And why does that matter? Well, when a technology goes from being this rare, wildly expensive curiosity to something cheap and accessible, it stops being an experiment and transforms into a heavy-duty industrial tool. That massive, dramatic drop in cost, that's exactly what ignited this whole global competition.
Section 2. The US-China CRISPR clash. Now, it's really fascinating to see the stark contrast in strategies between these 2 superpowers. On one side, you have China moving with this incredibly aggressive, state-backed speed. In fact, the Chinese government explicitly named CRISPR a top strategic priority in their Made in China 2025 plan. And it shows. They've cranked out the highest volume of CRISPR research papers globally for 5 years running. Now contrast that with the United States, the actual birthplace of the tech. The US operates with much stricter ethical oversight from the FDA, which naturally means a longer, slower pathway for approvals. Plus, the US is currently tangled up in these massive intellectual property wars over patent royalties. We're talking billion-dollar legal battles, like the one between UC Berkeley and MIT's Broad Institute, just fighting over who actually owns the CRISPR patent. And because of their completely different regulatory environment, China has been able to move incredibly fast when it comes to human trials. They've already run CRISPR clinical trials on patients with lung cancer, HIV, and sickle cell disease. And if you look at the data, these trials are often happening years before equivalent trials even get a green light from the FDA in the United States. But as you might guess, this competition isn't just about medicine. There are massive military dimensions here too. The U.S. intelligence community, specifically in the Director of National Intelligence's annual threat assessment, has repeatedly flagged CRISPR as a potential weapon of mass destruction. I mean, think about it. The exact same tools we use to edit a patient's cancer cells could, theoretically, be used to engineer incredibly dangerous, targeted pathogens. And just to be clear, this isn't sci-fi movie stuff. China's People's Liberation Army has actually openly published research papers exploring gene editing in military contexts. The dual-use nature of CRISPR? It is a reality we are already living in.
Section 3. Navigating the ethical minefield.
Okay, so first up in this ethical minefield is germline editing. This basically means modifying embryos so that any genetic changes you make are hardwired to pass down to all future generations. That's exactly what He Jiankui did back in 2018. Now, the scientific consensus is that his specific work was incredibly reckless. No real informed consent, zero oversight. But interestingly enough, the U.S. National Academies of Sciences has actually stated that germline editing might be permissible down the line, as long as it's done under extraordinarily strict conditions. So yeah, that debate is definitely not closed.
Then we have the ecological side of things, gene drives.
This is where you use CRISPR to rapidly force genetic changes through entire populations in the wild. Imagine developing a gene drive to wipe out malaria-carrying mosquitoes or to completely control an invasive species. Sounds great, right? But the ethical catch is absolutely massive. Once you release a gene drive into the wild, it doesn't just politely stop at a national border. What one country considers conservation, their neighbor might view as a literal ecological weapon. It essentially turns genetics into a geopolitical tool disguised as environmental management.
Finally, we have to talk about the massive equity problem. Let's scale this whole thing down to a single number. 1. Just 1. What actually happens when a miraculous, life-saving genetic cure finally hits the market for a single patient? Who really gets access to it?
And this brilliantly illustrates the problem. $2.2 million. That is the actual price tag per patient for that Casgevy sickle cell drug that was approved in 2023. If the cost of curing a genetic disease is sitting at over $2 million, the stark, uncomfortable reality is that it's only going to be available to ultra-wealthy individuals in wealthy nations. Biosecurity experts are warning us that this isn't just a standard economic issue. It seriously risks creating a literal two-tiered humanity, the genetically enhanced and, well, everyone else.
Section 4. 3 scenarios for the future.
So, based on the general consensus among biosecurity experts, the next decade is likely going to unfold in one of 3 ways. Scenario 1 is parallel development. This is where the US and China just advance independently under their own separate rules, eventually creating 2 entirely different global CRISPR ecosystems. Scenario 2 is an international agreement. Think of a global biotech governance treaty, kind of like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But experts point out a massive, massive hurdle here. A biological lab is infinitely harder to monitor from a satellite than a giant nuclear centrifuge. A cutting-edge CRISPR lab looks exactly like your standard university biology department. Which brings us to Scenario 3, the one experts fear the most, an unregulated arms race. This is a path of relentless, unchecked competition that history tells us usually culminates in a major biotech accident or deliberate misuse, forcing us into a frantic global crisis response.
Science and geopolitical power are colliding right now, as we speak, and the rules of engagement, they are being written or completely ignored in real time. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: will we proactively write the rules for human DNA, or will we just wait until a massive biological crisis forces our hand? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. Keep exploring and never stop questioning the forces shaping our world.